Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever it may be as you're watching this. Welcome to the Boulder Bookstore's author Q&A. My name is Darren Swanson, the author of Towers of Hiva, a novel out this year in 2025. Thank you to the Boulder Bookstore for the opportunity here to share the story with all of you, and looking forward to the conversation. Um, we have a number of questions that Stephanie and the good folks at the Boulder Bookstore have lined up for us today, and we're going to march through each of those. But first, I'm joining you from Winnipeg, Canada, and the longitudinal center of North America, in fact, and the original home of Winnie the Pooh, believe it or not. But most importantly, I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting here on the traditional land of the First Nations, Treaty 1 territory here in Winnipeg, and the homeland of the Red River Métis, and as well the clean water that we enjoy here drinking in Winnipeg, sourced from the Shoal Lake 41st Nation. I recall the day that I first drove down to Boulder. One of my first jobs out of university after graduating engineering, civil engineering, was in Boulder, Colorado. And I remember like it was yesterday, even though it wasn't, driving on the first week of January, leaving Canada. I was in Saskatchewan at the time, leaving Saskatchewan and right in the cold January. We're talking minus 30 degrees outside, and arriving 18 hours later in Boulder, Colorado, and everybody was jogging around and biking in shorts and t-shirts. I thought, wow, this is a pretty cool place. And it turned out to be a very cool place. So shout out to all the friends in Boulder and Boulder area, and look forward to the next time I get a chance to visit. Um, Boulder is such a unique place, and the Pearl Street Walking Mall is one of the best out there. And it's a must visit, and I go there every time to stroll the shops in the Pearl Street Mall, and every visit absolutely is not complete without a visit to the Boulder Bookstore. So, without further ado, let's launch into the questions that Stephanie and the good folks have lined up for me. And of course, the first one is Darren, can you provide a synopsis of the book? I guess that part is a little important, and I guess that's what you're interested in. So, Towers of Hiva is a cautionary story about two lost civilizations. One lost perilously in the present, as seen through the eyes of the fictional character Alec James, a hotshot Wall Street stock trader. And the other tragically lost in the past, as seen through the eyes of King Hotu Matua, the great parent of the Rapa Nui people who settled Easter Island. Those two stories come crashing together when Alec discovers an ancient wooden tablet. The lost Rongo Rongo script of Easter Island has a message for the future, if only it can be deciphered in time. It's a story about the towers that we create and the towers that we unfortunately destroy. At its core, the novel is a realistic fiction story about the urgent need for enhanced understanding and literacy and peace, sustainability, and resilience, much like reading, writing, and arithmetic used to be. But it's also a multicultural love story, and we need a little bit of that these days. It's a story about truth and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and in this story with the Rapa Nui peoples of Easter Island. And we need a lot of that right now. In this context, it is the lived experience of Easter Island, and the Rapa Nui people, and we will get into that. It's a story about how throughout history we've, I guess, our maybe to put it, our technological maturity has always seemed to outpace our emotional maturity, leading us down some very dark paths. For example, why did our ability to build large sail ships, galleons that could travel the oceans, discover continents, find new places. Why did our ability to be able to do that lead to a global slave trade? So this is, circa the 1700s when those ships became to be. We had that ability, but somehow it ended up facilitating a global slave trade, which is insane. Why did, for example, now the digital age and the internet result in the global trading of an unregulated over-the-counter derivatives market? That paved the way for what we experienced in 2008, a debilitating global financial crisis that impacted everybody across the United States and the world. We keep doing insane things. What inspired me to write this book? I can trace it back to my experience at Harvard University back in 2001. I decided to pursue a graduate studies in international development, a master's in public administration, international development. I was a civil and environmental engineer, but I really had this pull or tug to try to understand the world in a bigger context. So not just understand the environment, but understand the economy and society. So I applied and was accepted to the Harvard Kennedy School. So I'm there in 2001, a brand new program, and I was taking a class that was given by a noted economist, Professor Jeffrey Sachs. And he made us read copious amounts of historic literature in this history of development class. One class, we had the good fortune to have a guest speaker, and that guest speaker was Jared Diamond, very well-known author of, for example, Guns, Germs, and Steel. Jared Diamond was speaking to the class about a book he was writing at the time called Collapse, which is a published book now, of course. But back in 2001, it was being researched, and Jared Diamond spoke of Easter Island as an example of a society that had flourished and then collapsed. And I was completely taken by the story. Jared Diamond, in his book Collapse, talked of what many describe as an ecocide type narrative, where the islanders used the resources and cut down the trees, and then there was a collapse of the society, resulting from food security, from the loss of the forests, and then the society collapsed after that. That is sort of known as the ecocide narrative. But what I discovered after researching and doing more reading about Easter Island, because I was so enthralled by the story and being a student of sustainability, I thought, wow, this is a very interesting story. I need to learn more about it. But as I triangulated across the history books, I discovered a much more complicated and a much more nuanced story of Easter Island's environment and society and their type of economy at the time, and the circumstances that surrounded a convergence of crises that led to the collapse of Easter Island. And suffice it to say here that it is much more complex than you might read in one history book, and a much more complicated story than just having a narrative about the trees being cut down. I won't get into the details. You'll have to read the book for that, even Google a bit of history. But the trauma of first contact with Westerners plays a core role in this, a central role in this. And it's a story, of course, that repeats itself in history in continents around the world. Deep story. And so there was a big motivation, and that inspired me to write about the story of Easter Island in a different way. There are a lot of history books and lots of Indigenous historians on the island. But the narrative of Easter Island, the narrow narrative of Easter Island, seems to be surviving in the general sort of psyche of people around the world. And so I wanted to convey the story in a fictional sense for readers to bump into this truth story that is out there. Okay, so that's one. That was one inspiration. Another inspiration happened while I was at the Harvard Kennedy School in 2000 and 2001. One, of course, was when I was as a student of as an economics student in this program. I did learn more about economics, and I did learn about the Asia financial crisis that happened in the 90s, and a series of factors, a very debilitating big financial crisis. But there were other things that were happening around that time. There was a big financial crisis, collapse of what's called the over-counter derivatives market at the time. And there was, in fact, a hedge fund firm that started up and was based in Connecticut, in fact. And you read about it in the story. The fictional characters bump into these real life settings, like Forrest Gump did. The fictional characters bump into real life people that appear in the history books, in the news headlines, in the archives, because of the notable things that occurred. And so you'll read about and hear about real history in the context of the lives of these fictional characters. And so Alec James is the hotshot sort of over-the-counter derivatives trader that you will meet in the story right off in the early chapters. And he bumps into this whole world of over-the-counter derivatives trading, which was an unregulated market in the 1990s, which led to a very significant collapse as banks from around the world started to invest in this new hedge fund firm's main product that was informed by a sophisticated options pricing model that a group of Nobel laureates had put together and used to inform the investment that was very attractive, earning very high rates of return on its ability to anticipate convergence trades and its ability to anticipate the market. And so I learned about this, and I learned a lot about economic crises, and I found it extremely interesting. And while I was studying that very context, came September 11th, 2001. And I was sitting at my computer at the computer in the library at the Harvard Kennedy School in Boston, in Cambridge. And the World Trade Center towers were attacked and collapsed before my very eyes. My wife had been working as an emergency nurse in Cambridge, and they were put on notice to expect survivors, anticipating the hospitals in New York would be overflowing with trauma patients, which indeed did not turn out to be the case. That left a huge uh, image and an impression in my mind as to what, because that really was an altering, trajectory altering incident, event in the American history and the global history. Um, I had visited the World Trade Tower only months before that on a weekend getaway, and sat atop of the World Trade Towers. And the question, what inspired me to write this book? It was learning about towers, the towers that we've erected in history, the towers that we've erected in modern day, and the towers that we have destroyed, and why, and what does that mean, and what is that telling us, and what do we need to hear and learn. So the characters evolve around these settings, and provide some serious backdrop to some serious issues. At heart, it's a love story between an American and a Muslim woman who happens to be uh, with the fictionally with the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, who was trying to regulate the over-the-counter derivatives market. She and Alec fall in love, but they're on opposite sides of this market, this Wild West market, and so the tension is already there, and their attraction is instant. You can see Roshanak's image on the novel cover, and you see the image of Alec looking up at everything, and King Hotumatua in the backdrop in a different time, trying to speak to Alec in his dreams. And we start to learn over time what that is all about. Let's talk about the next question. What kind of research did I do to write this story? I described a bit of that already, in terms of, I guess the inspirational part was part of a research journey at school, began at in school. But as I started to um, uh, form this into a story, which began as a screenplay, to tell you the truth, which I eventually felt more comfortable writing in more narrative flow. I just the ideas and the creative process to me was more natural if I wrote in a novel format as opposed to screenplay format. So I thought, okay, I'm going to do that first because it just feels more natural for my creative process. Um, but the research that I did on the book followed a bit of my day job. So in my work as a sustainable development professional, I was a student of systems thinking and also futures thinking. So my day job involved facilitating what's called strategic foresight or scenario planning exercises for communities, for organizations, for governments to imagine different plausible futures that could exist and how that might influence what we need to do today to achieve prosperity economically or to achieve a healthy environment and societal well-being. So there was a process called of scenario planning, which is a fairly well thought out process that has been used quite a bit by organizations and experts around the world. And I followed that process to help me understand all the key factors and drivers that would influence the kind of the core plot or the core characters in my novel. And that was a very useful process. It was a structured scenario foresight process that I did follow that helped me kind of know where to research the different aspects. And in this story, Towers of Eve, a lot happens all at once. A lot of things happen, and that's by design because that is reality. In reality, things can happen at once. Perfect storms of crises can come together. a lot of crises that may be quite interconnected can come together and really affect the ability of a society to flourish, and even could affect collapse. So these types of polycrisis or metacrisis, or even just sort of distinct perfect storms of issues can come together. And the point of the story is that we live through those. But the story talks about how we may not be fully equipped yet or fully mature to understand and deal with these crises as they come together, or even deal with the technology that we have to advance our prosperity. We seem to keep doing things that don't make sense and are not mature. We have technology, but then we do insane things with them. And this has been happening throughout uh, uh, recent history. And the story is about trying to understand um, and amplify the fact that these things are happening and pause to think. The research process, again, was fueled and initially informed by a foresight scenario process. And in fact, in retrospect, I'm looking back on that process now, and it was quite unique. And so I'm going to be working to package that in a bit of a learning format and rolling that out to authors as something to be offered through the publishing imprint for the novel Futures. So stay tuned for that aspect as that starts to take shape. But the research was, again, it was a process that began early and was quite an academic process, and triangulating across multiple history books. Truth comes out of reading multiple perspectives from different researchers and authors. Truth is a thing you have to work for when you're researching. You can't just take one book and just conclude that was history. What are a couple of the books that I've read recently that I really loved? Good question. As I was finishing the story, the novel, I really did have an epiphany light bulb moment as I was kind of done the writing process and had going through the beta reader process. And by the way, in terms of writing process, going back to that, beta readers are your best friends if you're a writer. Find people who will read your book, take their advice, their inputs, what they liked, what they didn't, and work with that and do that from get lots of different insights from that. But as I was finishing or getting set to publish the book, I was really reflecting on what was the question, what were the questions that I was left with after sort of the story had finished, because I was really struggling with them, with this idea of what I'm calling a societal maturity gap, where our technological maturity seems to always outpace our emotional maturity to use that technology in a way that makes sense and is humane. And so I was left with this historical lesson from the Rapa Nui, the lived experience of Rapa Nui, the modern example of financial crises that could have been averted in a more regulated market in the day. And I was really pressed myself as to what was happening, because I did not have the answer to that. So I found myself reading a lot as I finished my book to learn more about this question of why do we continue to do some really insane things, and even sort of now in common day. So we had the technology to create the combustion engine. which was an amazing invention and helped society flourish in ways that weren't even imagined at the time. But how did that have to then result in um, a complete sort of change in our climate system? Um, how did it go from that to now our climate is changing and we're dealing with severe weather and floods and wildfire and the catastrophes and the loss of lives from that? So we're here. We're in that one now. We got the climate crisis now. Um, so it keeps going, and now we've got artificial intelligence, amazing technology, just incredible technology, but it's getting to the point now where that's that new frontier. Is like, are we gonna do insane things again, as history tells us we will? So I read lots. Back to the question, what am I reading? Books that I'm reading that I really like. I really like the book. I bumped into a book by Thomas Bjorkman called "The World We Create." And that seemed to sort of really try to answer some of those questions, looking throughout human history in terms of the world views and meta views that sort of became to be, that we as people created, from God to science to now markets, economy, as a sort of a guiding meta narrative. Very interesting book, The World We Create. And uh, Thomas Bjorkman was a Swedish investment banker, now turned social entrepreneur, and really digging into these types of questions. And he was a co-founder of something called the Inner Development Goals, an organization based out of Stockholm, but a global movement of academics and civil society people thinking about these softer skills of how we could really make society flourish and prosper, and help make progress in these things called the Global Sustainable Development Goals, which are a set of goals that all countries agreed to achieve and reach through the United Nations system. Crossing from poverty to education to health to the environment to peace and innovation. It's the full gamut. The world's first global sort of strategic plan in history, in fact, the Sustainable Development Goals and its 2030 agenda. But we're kind of stuck in the mud. So there are people like Thomas Bjorkman and now a whole organizational movement through the Inner Development Goals to understand our soft skills and our maturity levels to actually make progress toward well-being in our economy, society, and the environment. So that's one recent book that really jumps to mind, that has been helpful to me to answer some of the questions that I was left with after writing my own story. Well, writing my story, it wasn't my story; it was history's story. I just created a fourth Gumpian fiction version to help people get into these complex issues and important stories of history and realize the truths in them. Is there anything else I would like you to know about my book, Towers of Hiva? Um, well, it is an award finalist. In fact, just a few weeks ago from this recording, I received a finalist award from the American Fiction Awards in the category of multicultural fiction. So I am very excited about that, and to know that the I guess the sophisticated and complex nature of the multi-story that it is, multicultural, multi-generational, multi-issue story that it is, was meant a lot to me, and I think as readers, it gives you confidence too that the story is is sound and interesting to readers. Okay, the next question that the good friends at the Boulder Bookstore have posed to me is can I read a short passage from my book? Absolutely. Now, this is right out of the gate. Chapter 1, um, Polynesia, the year 1000 AD. With sea salt crusted to his eyelashes, he could barely manage to squint. The reflecting light pierced his eyes and sent a rush of pain through his head. The reward for scanning the blue horizon from his thatched shelter atop the double-hulled canoe only reminded him of the reality of his confines and his family's. At best recollection, Hotu believed they had been on the open water for 20 sunrises. What have I done? So, as I had mentioned, I think briefly before, the Polynesians were immensely skilled ocean voyagers. And if you want to get a sense for that, actually, the Disney movies Moana really actually capture the essence of that skill. So that is kind of a nice piece and nice context. And so the journey that King Hotu Matua and his family on the three large outrigger canoes that did eventually land on Rapa Nui um, is just an incredible journey, and you'll sort of, I try to help you feel that journey in the first and opening chapter to the novel. Uh, uh, but the collapse of the flourishing Easter Island population and Rapa Nui peoples is a story, in actuality, a story of resilience of Indigenous peoples under extreme circumstances and from the debilitating impacts of first contact with Westerners. So this is Washington, D.C., circa 1995. A few quiet minutes passed as the women enjoyed the warm sunshine. Katie, as usual, broke the silence. Roshanak, did you hear who might be up for our next chair of the Trading Commission? Roshanak was gazing at the sky again and was slow to respond. Katie sighed and waved her hand in front of her face to get her attention. Roshanak apologized again and said excitedly, "No, who?" She was genuinely curious in hearing that Katie might have some inside information on much discussed topic at work. Katie says, "Brooksley Bourne," with a wide-eyed grin that signaled her approval. Roshanak reacted instantly. "No way." She paused and continued, "She'd be perfect. I hope it's more than just a rumor." The two of them knew Bourne's name well. Brooksley Bourne was a partner at Arnold and Porter law firm and led the derivatives division. And the rumor around Washington a few years ago was that she was being touted as the next U.S. Attorney General, a testament to her success as a lawyer in several high-profile market cases, including when the billionaire Hunt brothers tried to corner the world silver market in the 1970s. Brooksley had also been a champion of women in law, starting the first women's caucus at the American Bar Association and delivering what was believed to be one of the first university courses focused on women and law at Columbia. Roshanak had been an admirer of hers since her graduate studies at Georgetown University. While there, Roshanak wrote an essay on Brooksley's accomplishments in public policy issues and as a successful woman in what was traditionally a man's business. Okay, so enter, in Forrest Gumpian fashion, a real life person, Brooksley Bourne, who is in the backdrop and will eventually be Roshanak's boss. So Brooksley Bourne was the head of the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission that was trying to regulate the over-the-counter derivatives market in the late 1990s. And she was appointed by President Clinton. And this was a very profitable sector, as you will learn through the story, through a hedge fund firm that was had provided one of the most sort of lucrative investments that banks from around the world were leveraging quite heavily. But it's a real David and Goliath story, though, what Brooksley Born was up against, because very influential people like Alan Greenspan at the time, the chair of the U.S. Federal Reserve, and others like Larry Summers, who served as deputy secretary of the Treasury during that time. They just, neither of them wanted that market or felt that market should be regulated. So it flourished, and it flourished unregulated in an unregulated manner. And it eventually resulted in a lot of banks and investors being way over leveraged, and the actual hedge firm being way over leveraged in this. And when the Asia financial crisis happened and a few other things happened, it just created a massive financial crisis and required a bailout. And no, I'm not talking about 2008 yet. This is 10 years before that, in 1998. But the unregulated over-the-counter derivatives market is the basic principle that led to the subprime mortgage crisis, because those were in fact derivatives packaged and repackaged to the point where no one really knew what was in them. And it resulted in what happened. And again, so there's a real story inside the story there that is in the backdrop of Roshanak and Alex journey together. And so, yeah, and that's just a modern day story. So I hope you kind of that gave you a bit of a flavor. Lots going on in Towers of Hiva, both in the past and in the recent past, distant past, and the recent past. And the part that I hope you enjoy as a reader is the connection that is trying to be made. King Hotumatua appearing in Alex's dreams, and mysteriously trying to tell Alex something or to help him. Alec does not know why or how this is happening, and you as a reader will not know why this is happening, and you, as part of the journey of the story, is to experience and help and witness Alec try to uncover this connection to the past, and to and for both King Hotumatua and his family and Alec and Roshanak to survive the multiple crises that are happening in their times, that are happening for various reasons. I hope you enjoy the story. It's packed full of important history and truths that people should be aware of, if not already. And it leaves you with, and I think, important questions about the future that are super urgent right now. So look for the book, Boulder Bookstore, in stock. And hope you enjoy. And Boulder Bookstore, thank you so much for the opportunity to share the story with your readers. And I look forward to visiting your store again on my next trek down the Pearl Street Mall. Bye, everybody.